This is the first in our 6 presentation series. Today, our presenter is August Jenkins. August is a 5th-year doctoral candidate in the Human Development and Family Studies program at Penn State, and she is a pre-doctoral Individual National Service Award Diversity Fellow, which is supported by the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. August studies the intersections between relationship adjustment and psychological health among Black couples and families from both a social, ecological, and gender perspective. In addition to being a scholar and researcher, she is also the aunt of 2 amazing nibblings, a nephew and a niece, and she enjoys baking, reading novels, doing arts and crafts, crocheting, and socializing with friends. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to August. So feel free to share your screen. I will also ask if you have any questions throughout, just put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Happy listening.
Thank you, Carmen. As she said, I'm August Jenkins, and I will be talking today about how racism is more than color, the role of context in Black family experiences. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to briefly highlight the perception of Black families in the general society, and then delving into how we can understand racism, specifically the multiple ways that it impacts Black family life, and then further how we can center individuals' experiences with racism in this broader issue, and then summarize all the things we're going to talk about and hopefully provide some helpful takeaways that we can use in our everyday life. So perceptions of Black families, both in the broader discourse publicly and within research specifically, have often been negative when it comes to Black individuals. So you have things like the sapphire trope, which is the image or the idea of this really nagging, sort of berating Black woman who belittles and demeans her partner. And you have things like the welfare queen, right? So Black women are bringing all these children into these poor conditions really just to get some type of economic benefit or welfare. And then there are terms like broken home or broken families that are related to the idea of like the absentee or the neglectful Black father, right? So Black children have no idea who their father is. They're not part of their life. Or if they are a part of it, that they're very disengaged, sort of not involved in and out. And these more cultural ideas are supported by very concrete and structural issues. So for instance, you have the Moynihan Report, which was commissioned during the 1960s under President Johnson. And basically what it said was that all the problems, right, that the Black community faces, poverty, violence, drugs, all these things can be blamed on the broken Black family, the breakdown in family structure, these female headed households. And that report was used to guide a lot of policy, federal initiatives, funding agendas, all built off of this sort of very widespread idea that Black families are pathological in some way. They're dysfunctional, they're just bad, they're less than and broken. And so in addition to being problematic, this idea of this negative perception of Black families really hinders the ability to understand couple and family functioning for the Black community, right? Because it separates Black families from the environment in which they live. So we don't have to understand the processes because they're bad, but the reason why they're bad isn't given any context. They haven't been situated in the context in which Black family life is unfolding. And so what is this environment or this context that Black families are living in? If you've ever seen Blackish, then you know the answer always comes back to racism. So racism is basically a system that is based on the idea of ranking or categorizing groups according to their race. And really, it's when the dominant group devalues, disempowers, and differentially allocates desirable societal opportunities and resources to groups categorized as inferior. So that's a very long definition, but we're going to talk about how this actually plays out in Black families and Black people's lives. Um, Black families are living in an environment of ubiquitous forms of racial oppression, right? Since racism is a system, it's not just a thing that's happening, it is the entire environment in which all Black family life is unfolding. And so they're being constantly subject to the stress of living in this type of environment. So living in a racist environment, the stress from that has a name, and it's called mundane extreme environmental stress, or MEES. And that's a very long name, right? Sort of abstract. What does it mean? Why is it called that? And so I'm going to break it down word by word. So the mundane part is because the stress is so common, a part of the day-to-day experience of all Blacks, that's almost taken for granted, right? Because racism is the system in which we live, it's the operating system, it's the environment, it's ingrained in everything. It's extreme because it has a harsh impact on the psyche and worldview of Blacks, right? So it affects self-perceptions, behaviors, interactions. It's environmental because it is environmentally induced and fostered. And we're calling it stress because the ultimate impact on African Americans and their families is indeed stressful, detracting, and energy consuming. So Black people and Black families are living in an environment that in and of itself is acting as a constant stressor. It disrupts and constrains, it impedes all aspects of family life. And how does it do that? How is racism as an environment impacting Black families? And it operates through multiple pathways. So racism operates at a structural level, at a cultural level, and at an interpersonal level. And so one of the most classic examples of structural racism you can see in neighborhoods and housing. So a long history of institutionalized and legal practices related to residential segregation, such as things such as like redlining and covenant housing discrimination, have resulted in Black families being disproportionately placed in neighborhoods and areas that are poor quality. And so it not only affects where Black people and Black families are living, but the types of stressors they're exposed to, right? So more poverty or violence or crime or things along those lines. And also the resources that are available to them within their neighborhoods. And empirical research supports that neighborhood stressors and resources have an impact on Black mental health, but also on Black relationships, on marital quality, on marital behaviors, and the connections between mental health and family functioning. And cultural racism is really getting at what we were talking about in the beginning, right? These negative ideas and perceptions of Black people, of Black, the less thanness that's pervasive in all of society about when it comes to Black families. And those ideas can be internalized by Black people themselves, and they have negative impacts on relationship satisfaction and functioning as well, for Black couples and families. And then interpersonal racism is really what we often think of when we think about how racism is. And it's those experiences of discrimination that an individual has. So when someone says something to you or does something to you or calls you something, those are experiences of discrimination. And that's an example of interpersonal racism. And experiences of discrimination aren't just don't just happen to one person, right? For Black families, they're often shared with your family members and intimate others. And so it's transformed into this family experience. And so the individual members are exposed to more stress than that which they experience themselves, right? Because this is impacting the family now. And so experiences of discrimination can negatively impact mental health and relationship functioning. But experiences of discrimination, the effects of experiences of discrimination on mental health also can depend on right? Your romantic relationship and your family relationship as well. And so those are the multiple ways through which racism as an environment acts as a constant stressor for Black families. But in addition to the environment itself being a constant stressor, it also amplifies the effects of other stressors Black families may encounter that in and of themselves don't have to be inherently racial or racially based. And that's kind of like hard to separate. Like, what do you mean the environment versus being a stressor versus amplifying stressor? And so, one example that is used to describe this is life in the Arctic, right? The Arctic environment is incredibly harsh, right? You have sub zero temperatures, you have like dangerous wildlife, like polar bears and things like that. You are exposed to higher levels of ultraviolet radiation. There are all these dangers that make being in the Arctic a very dangerous environment. And your body is stressed when it's there. If I send you to the Arctic, right? That environment in of itself is going to be a stress on your body because you're trying not to get hypothermia or frostbite or any of these bad things that could happen to you because the environment is so harsh, the climate is so harsh, right? But then if I tell you you have to make a life for yourself in the Arctic, you have to find a job, you have to be able to commute every day to work, you have to raise your family, find food, all these regular, everyday, mundane tasks, those become exceedingly harder simply because of the environment in which you're trying to do them is so harsh. And it's the same idea for Black families. Living in a racist environment in and of itself is harsh. But any of the regular activities that Black families have to do become exceedingly harder because they're doing it in this hostile, toxic environment. And so, what are some examples? Like, how does that actually happen for Black families? Well, in the couple of recent years, a hashtag has become popular called Living While Black, right? And so that is speaking to this very idea that these regular activities, when done as a Black person or with your Black family, become dangerous, right? Or downright life threatening when done as a Black person because of the environment in which you're living in. So, here, if you Google it, there are a list of things that, when done as a Black person in this environment, can result in you being arrested or fined, cussed out, threatened, or even killed. So, things like following a guy on a court when you're playing basketball or trying to go swimming at a swimming pool, like all these activities are that are regular become even more stressful as a Black person. So about a year ago, just around this time, it was a guy who went bird watching in a park and asked a woman to put her dog on a leash. And when you do that as a Black person, right, that effect of what should be a regular mundane activity becomes amplified. Or a couple of months ago, it was a Black man and his son who were staying in a hotel, and they were literally attacked because a woman lost her phone or a teen lost her phone, right? So all these everyday mundane activities become extreme when done as a Black person because of the environment in which you're living in. So the environment in of itself is acting as a stressor for Black families, and it's amplifying the effects of other stressors for Black families. And that is what's creating this added burden, this mundane but extreme environmental stress that families are having to deal with. And that can have negative implications for Black family functioning and outcomes. And it's this added stress that can have negative consequences for well being and mental health and relationship quality and family functioning. Now, what's important to remember is that while all Black families might be facing the common problem of racism and living in this oppressive, racially oppressive environment, there is an individual and unique experience of this common problem, right? So while all Black families may be exposed to this environmental stress, they don't all have the same experience living with it. And that's because every family has a distinct position within society, right? Every family is made up of members who have multiple aspects to their identity. They're more than just Black, right? And so now what we're talking about is intersectionality, right? I'm more than just Black, I'm more than just this ethnic group. I'm also this gender, this class, this skin tone, this sexuality, and all these other aspects to their identity. And because are diverse in the identities that they have, they are placed in different positions in society that can make them more or less susceptible to the environmental stress of me. So the experience of being a dark skin, but upper middle class, Caribbean family is going to be Black family is going to be different than being a lighter skin, working class, lesbian family. Like those are very different experiences, but they are all having to deal with this mundane, extreme environmental stress. So, because families have different positions in society, they have differences in their vulnerability to stress because they're converging forms of oppression. So, they might be all experiencing this environmental stress of racism, but there's also sexism and sexism and heterosexualism and colorism and classism. And these forms of oppression can converge to impact Black families in unique and multiple ways. And so it's important that when we're trying to study Black families, specifically when we're trying to get back to this idea of situating families and individuals within the environment that they're living, is recognizing that there are differences for everyone in their vulnerability and also their ability to regenerate from the environmental stress that they're facing. And I highlight the regenerative ability because we want to make sure that we're not doing what we talked about at the very beginning, feeding into this negative pathological view of Black families, but recognizing that they experience stress, but there are also individual differences in the strengths that and resources that are available to every Black family as well. And so families are equipped and have available to them different resources and supports. And that also depends on the intersections of their identities and where they're located in society. And so some things that are considered to be resources, especially relevant for Black families, are things like religion and spirituality. The Black church has played a very big part both in moving the Black community forward, but also in being instrumental in Black family functioning, or a sense of racial pride and identity, the use and connections with extended family networks, or even for some people, a sense of neighborhood cohesion, right? So we talked before about how neighborhoods give both stressors, but and resources. And so feeling a sense of community, or even having available political capital or political power in your community, these can all be resources available to Black families to help them deal with and cope with the environmental stress that they're facing. But which one of these or all of these and how are available to families and how important they are or how they're used varies, and that depends on individuals' identities and their social position. And then one other thing I want to bring up to you is that there's variability in families' perceptions of environmental stress itself, right? So the meaning that people and families make of the environmental stress that they encounter is different. Some people encounter it and it's very personal to them because they feel like it's a sense of violation for these cultural norms that we have around fairness and equality, right? So when I experience this type of environmental stress, it feels like a personal attack on me, like what's called the defilement of stress. For others, it's seen more ambiguous, right? I don't know if this is because of my race. It might be because of some other aspect of my identity. It might be because of multiple aspects of my identity, right? So there's this sense of ambiguity and unsureness around how to interpret the stressors that they're facing. Or I'm just going to take a racially colorblind perspective, right? I'm going to be like, that person, this happened because someone had a bad day, or this happened because I didn't work hard enough, right? People make different meaning of the experiences that of the different experiences of environmental stress. And then there are differences in what coping mechanisms are available to people, like what they perceive as appropriate reactions to stress varies from person and from family to family. So one very salient, often thought about coping resource is the superwoman, the Black superwoman complex, right? And it's this idea that Black women are, and Black femininity is supposed to be all about strength, all about self-sufficiency. I'm supposed to be strong regardless of all of the stressors and strain that I face in my life. I have to be strong and I can't break down, right? Not only because I can't enough of myself, but I have to be there for other people and support my family members. And so that can lead to a sense of depression, of denial and suppression, and not even being able to acknowledge the impacts that this environmental stress has, especially for Black women. And so it's the combination of these things, right? Of an individual and the family vulnerability to environmental stress and the resources they have to deal with it, and the perceptions that they make and the meanings that they make of the stress that impact a family's ability to be stressed, de-stressed, or have some type of crisis or demonstrate resiliency to what they encounter. And there are differences between families and individuals in this ability. So to summarize, because you talked about a lot of things, the takeaway points are that racism manifests through multiple pathways to affect Black couples and family well-being. But importantly, taking a holistic approach to study Black families, really situating them within their environmental context, highlights the unique stresses and stressors that Black families face, as well as highlighting the specific and individualized experiences that Black families have in dealing with this stress. And so, if we're thinking about this as an environmental issue, what can we do as individuals, right? We're recognizing that racism is bad, especially for Black families, but how do we take action ourselves? So, first, I would say making sure that we're thoughtful about the words that we're using and choosing language specifically to counter these harmful stereotypes that exist about Black families, right? So, are we using terms like broken families, broken homes, welfare queen? Are we saying things that are feeding into or that are avoiding harmful stereotypes? And similarly, when we're encountering these narratives that are overly broad or overly negative about Black families, are we challenging them? Are we pushing back when people are saying things in the media or even in conversations? How are we challenging these narratives, right, about Black families? And then are we being thoughtful about not taking a colorblind approach? If the environment that we're living in is racist, then how can we be colorblind to it, right? That's not going to be helpful. It's just going to miss the very important context that's affecting the lives, experiences, and outcomes for these people. And then finally, making sure that we are believing and supporting individuals, people of color, but specifically Black people and families when they tell us and when they speak about their own experience and their intersecting experiences of environmental stress. And then for people of color ourselves and for Black people, making sure that we are taking time to validate and affirm ourselves in an environment that is constantly targeting and chipping away at a sense of self-worth, at a sense of family and community, and building and taking time to invest in finding as many resources as possible to help us resist that. And so I just want to leave you with a few resources if this was interesting to you, if you enjoyed this or want to learn more. These are some of the papers that, empirical papers, journal papers that I've used to put this presentation together. But here are some films and TV shows and some readings that I would highly recommend. They're all very good and are a great point to continue learning. and trying to move forward in this journey. And so I just want to thank you all for being an attentive audience and for being here.
Thank you so much, AJ. That was a really great presentation. If you have any questions, I would encourage you right now to put them in the chat. Look at all these hand claps. People really loved it.
Thank you.
I was like, but to get the ball rolling, I have a question for you that I wrote down. So you mentioned throughout your speech that there were stereotypes and tropes that were put on Black families and Black women specifically, like the sapphire trope and the strong superwoman Black trope, the strong woman Black trope. Could you give some examples of what those are for people who are not very familiar with what those look like?
Right. Yeah. I think it's so many that are in society that are often put, but I think it's helpful to name them so we have a word for them when we encounter them, but also it's helpful to give those examples. So I think especially for like the sapphire trope, when you have someone like if you ever seen Everybody Hates Chris, like the mother on there, right? She was always like yelling, nagging, or for example, Why Did I Get Married, right? The Tasha character who's always yelling, Marcus, Marcus, right? That's the sapphire trope, right? Just really overbearing and berating, almost to a belittling degree. And when you have like the strong woman, I think a lot of people would think of like Michelle Obama, right? She's the strongest, the classiest, right? The exemplar of a Black woman who's persevered. And that's in spite of, all of the negative comments that people had to say about her, especially during the 2008 election, right? So many comparisons about her looks, right? Her physique, about the way she talked, the terrorist fish jab, right? All these things that were supposed to, that people directed at her, but she was never able to clap back. She was never able to sort of falter. And so like a sensitivity, right? And a vulnerability and impact of that. She just had to remain strong and be that rock beside Barack Obama as they were running in the election. So I think those are some just obvious examples of those type of stereotypes and tropes, but it's literally so many out there. It's crazy.
Right. Thank you so much for expounding upon that. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I want to give it another second, but I also wanted to ask you what inspired you to begin researching?
Oh wow. I think it was an evolution. I think originally I started doing research just because I was told that was something you could do, for class credit, or it's a way to get involved. And I think once I got involved in the research process, like really trying to be thoughtful about what it is I wanted to learn more about. I think that research is the opportunity for you to try to get answers to questions that there aren't already answers for out there in the world. And I think there are a lot of questions about Black families and about why things happen the way they do, right? Why things are harder, why things might be better in some cases, but they're also like we've been talking about so much negativity when it comes to Black families, right? Not really centering their experiences um, in a positive light. And I felt like as a Black person, we need to change this. Like we need to be leading this work to have a say in creating a new narrative about ourselves and in learning how to find out how to bring about the outcomes that we want to see. And so I think that's really what's just been driving me since then.
I think that's a really noble cause.
Thank you.
Oh, we do have a question in the chat. I was like, this comes from Ashley. Do you have any recommendations for trying to dispel the trope narratives within ourselves as Black people?
That is a very good question, Ashley. I think first, the first step I would say for trying to dispel it within yourself is recognizing that it is a narrative, and trying to pinpoint where it's coming from, right? So if I'm having this idea either about myself or about other Black people, right, is this something that is common, that is seen in the rest of society, or is this something I've just made up myself? More than likely it's something that you've seen and been exposed to time and time and time again, right? And so being kind with yourself and then being honest and where this is coming from, right? And that this isn't something that has to be true. This is just something that's been presented to me multiple times. And then really working to counter that narrative within yourself. So finding examples that don't support whatever conclusion or belief that you have, like buying into and being really intentional about seeking out positive examples, positive situations or experiences that might counter that narrative. Um, and then working with others, talking like this isn't just internalizing racism isn't just something that happens to one person. It's something that all of us are having to work against as well. So joining people with you in your fight to combat internalized racism makes it easier because that's going to start to change your social environment so that everyone is trying to pick up on and counter these narratives as well.
Really thoughtful answer, August. I would have to agree. As a therapist, I think a lot about these things and how to get clients to really recognize that these things are not true and it's something that they're carrying. So kind of asking the question, do you hold other people who don't look like you to these same standards? And also with the kindness piece, I love that you spoke on that, being kind and gentle, because we have a hard time, no matter who we are, of really being critical. So always asking yourself, would I say this to a friend? Would I say
Mhm.
this to somebody I love? And if it doesn't pass that test, maybe don't say it.
Yeah, yeah, that's great advice.
Ashley said, thank you so much for that response.
You're so welcome, Ashley.
Well, I'm not seeing any other question in the chat. So I would like to just thank everyone for their time. Also, just remind you guys to watch for a brief feedback survey that we'll be emailing you. Also, we hope to see you guys next week for Becky Belinsky's Real Talk on exploring the impact of weight stigma. And just one more big thank you to August. We really appreciate you being here. Um, Love to work with you again.
Thank you. And thank you all again for attending.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.